The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every pair of eyes locked onto the man in the defendant's chair. Malcolm Graves. A well-dressed black man, hands cuffed in front of him, his suit neatly pressed, but his dignity shackled. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, he looked like a criminal, a man who had finally met the consequences of his actions. But for those who knew better, for those who had followed the headlines, this was something else. This was a message. Across the room, Detective Jack Ridley and Officer Daniel Thompson sat at the prosecution's table, their uniforms crisp, their confidence unshaken. Ridley, the older of the two, leaned back with a smug grin, as if he were watching a game he had already won. Thompson, younger but just as assured, cast occasional glances toward Malcolm, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Impatient, eager. They thought they had him. They thought this was the final nail in his coffin. The gallery whispered, speculation hanging thick in the air. The media had already shaped the narrative. A reckless agitator, a man who refused to follow the rules, finally brought to justice. Prominent activist faces trial for interfering with law enforcement. Did Malcolm Graves overstep his boundaries? Hero or threat? And yet, through all the noise, all the judgment, Malcolm sat still. Unshaken, unmoved, silent, no anger, no desperation, no pleading for mercy, just patience. And in that patience, there was something unsettling. Because for all their confidence, for all their self-assurance, Ridley and Thompson had no idea who they had just put on trial. And soon they would find out. Who exactly is Malcolm Graves? A criminal? A disruptor? Or a man who knows something these officers would rather keep buried? The gavel was about to drop. The trial would begin. But before we step inside that courtroom, we need to go back to the night that set everything in motion. It had been a good night. One filled with hope. A night where Malcolm Graves stood before his community, speaking not just about change, but about the power they held to demand it. The small but packed event hall buzzed with conversation as people filtered out into the cool evening air. Malcolm had spent the past hour discussing voting rights, police reform, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Not with violence, not with anger, but with knowledge, with unity, with an unshakable demand for accountability. Now standing on the steps of the community center, he loosened his tie and inhaled deeply. It was moments like these that reminded him why he did what he did, why he kept fighting, even when the system pushed back. Then he heard it. A voice, frail, elderly, trembling. "Please, I just want to go home." Malcolm turned. A few doors down, at the entrance of an aging apartment complex, an elderly black woman stood on her porch, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Two uniformed officers blocked her way. One held a flashlight inches from her face, the other scribbled something onto a notepad, his posture stiff with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. Something about the scene didn't sit right. Malcolm didn't rush over. He wasn't reckless. He had been in enough situations to know how quickly things could turn. Instead, he walked with purpose, calm, measured, unthreatening. His hands were in his pockets, his voice steady. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" One of the officers turned, Daniel Thompson. Younger than his partner, but already carrying the same air of unchecked power. His gaze flicked to Malcolm for half a second before he dismissed him entirely, turning back to his notepad. "Move along, sir. This doesn't concern you." Malcolm didn't move, not in defiance, but in quiet concern. "She's a resident here," he said evenly. "Is there a problem?" The elderly woman's eyes darted between them, wide with unease. She clutched the front of her cardigan tighter, as if bracing for something. "She needs to step inside," Thompson said flatly. "We're handling an investigation." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Then why won't you let her go home?" That's when everything shifted. The invisible line that always existed, but was rarely spoken, suddenly became visible. Jack Ridley stepped forward. Older, broader, meaner. A man whose uniform looked like it had been worn for too many years, and whose badge had long since become a shield for something darker. He studied Malcolm with the slow scrutiny of someone who had already decided he was a problem. Ridley didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. "Sir, I'm giving you a direct order. Walk away." But Malcolm wasn't in the way. He wasn't blocking anything, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't making a scene. He was just standing there. Still, Ridley's tone sharpened. You're interfering with police business. There it was, the phrase that had been used too many times in too many places against men who looked like Malcolm. The phrase that turned a lawful citizen into a suspect in the blink of an eye. Malcolm knew where this was going. He could hear the slight shuffling behind him, neighbors shifting, some reaching for their phones. A quiet street was no longer quiet. And then Ridley moved first, a hard shove to the chest. Malcolm barely had time to steady his footing before Thompson grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back. The crackle of a police radio, the sharp snap of metal against skin. Handcuffs. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman's voice, "He didn't do anything." A man's voice, angry, disbelieving. "You're arresting him for asking a question?" Ridley didn't care. Thompson didn't care. To them, this wasn't an injustice. This was control. As Malcolm was shoved forward, his shoes scraping against the pavement, he caught a glimpse of the elderly woman, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes filled with something he recognized too well. Helplessness. The car door yanked open. Malcolm was pushed inside. The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut was the dim glow of porch lights, the silhouettes of people watching. Some shaking their heads, some recording. Some standing frozen, silent, because they had seen this before. And none of them could stop what was happening. By morning, his face would be on every news station. His name would be dragged through headlines. And what no one realized yet, what not even Ridley and Thompson understood, was that they hadn't just arrested any man. They had just set off a chain of events that would shake the entire city. The world saw a routine police arrest. A man who questioned authority, who refused to step aside when told. A man who, in their eyes, had gotten himself in trouble. But that was a lie, because Malcolm Graves wasn't just some bystander who interfered with police business. He was a target. And this wasn't about a single night. This had been set in motion long before those cuffs ever touched his wrists. He should have seen it coming. The signs had been there. A car parked outside his office a little too long. Calls that dropped the moment he answered. The growing unease in his gut that told him someone was watching. And then, a week before his arrest, the warning had come. A call from Elliot Carter, a former cop, one of the few good ones, who had left the force under circumstances no one dared to question. "Malcolm," Elliot's voice had been low, tense. "You need to back off." "Back off from what?" A bitter chuckle. "Come on. You know exactly what. Whatever you think you found, they know you found it. Then why haven't they come after me yet?" A pause. "Because they want to see how far you'll go, and when they decide you've gone too far," another pause, "they'll handle it, the way they always do." Malcolm had heard the warning. He had understood it, and he had ignored it. Because he knew what was at stake. The Westbridge Police Department had secrets. Buried complaints, missing reports, investigations that started and mysteriously went nowhere. But Malcolm had seen the files. Evidence of planted drugs, beatings disguised as necessary force, officers protecting businesses that paid them and brutalizing communities that didn't. And someone had noticed. Noticed that he was asking the wrong questions. Noticed that he was meeting with the wrong people. Noticed that he wasn't afraid, so they did what they had always done. They waited for the right moment. The moment Malcolm had stepped forward that night, the moment he questioned why an elderly woman was being harassed on her own porch, he had given them exactly what they needed. A justification, a reason to pin him down, drag him off the street, and silence him before he could say one more word. And the timing? Perfect. A public arrest, in a quiet neighborhood, in front of cameras, witnesses, enough to frame the story exactly the way they wanted. By the time the sun rose, his name had already been poisoned. Local activist arrested for interfering with police investigation. Disruptor or defender? Was Malcolm Graves trying to incite a riot? A smear campaign already in motion before the cuffs had even come off his wrists. Because in their eyes, Malcolm wasn't just a problem. He was a threat. And threats had to be eliminated. As Malcolm sat in that courtroom, watching Ridley and Thompson smirk from across the room, he knew one thing for certain. They thought they had won. They had no idea how wrong they were. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Assistant District Attorney Colleen Marshall stood, smoothing out the lapels of her blazer. She was composed, confident, and methodical. The kind of prosecutor who didn't just present evidence, but carefully constructed narratives that juries wanted to believe. She turned to face the jury, her voice calm, unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about confusion. It's not about misunderstanding. It's about a man who thought he was above the law. She motioned toward Malcolm without so much as a glance, like he was a mere inconvenience in her well-rehearsed argument. A man who interfered with a lawful police investigation. A man who chose aggression over compliance. And today, we have the evidence to prove it. She gave a sharp nod to the bailiff. The lights dimmed. A screen flickered to life. The courtroom fell silent as the video played. At first, the footage seemed straightforward. A grainy black and white recording from a security camera overlooking the street. Malcolm was there, just as he had been that night, hands raised slightly, speaking to the officers. But then something changed. The footage jumped. A subtle cut, barely noticeable to an untrained eye. And suddenly, Malcolm wasn't just talking anymore. Now he was stepping forward. His posture was stiffer, his shoulders squared. His hands, once open and calm, now appeared tense, aggressive. Another jump, and now Officer Thompson was stumbling backward, his hands raised defensively. It was quick, almost too quick, but it was there. A moment carefully crafted to tell the story the prosecution wanted. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone whispered, "Did he just?" Marshall let the video linger for a moment longer, then gave another nod. The screen went black. The lights brightened. She turned back to the jury, her voice steady, deliberate. "You saw it with your own eyes. Mr. Graves wasn't an innocent bystander. He was aggressive, confrontational, a threat." She let the words hang, let them settle. Then, with a well-timed pause, she delivered her next blow. "And if that wasn't enough, we have an eyewitness." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A man stepped inside. Brian Tate, a former store clerk, a nobody. A man whose name had never been mentioned in connection to this case until now. He moved stiffly, his eyes darting around the room before settling on the witness stand. He took his oath, his voice barely above a whisper, then sat, hands clasped together like a man trying to steady himself. Marshall approached, her smile calculated, reassuring. "Mr. Tate, can you tell the jury what you saw that night?" Brian swallowed. His fingers tapped lightly against the wood of the stand, a nervous habit. Then he nodded. I was walking home from work," he began, his voice measured but tight. "And I saw him, Mr. Graves. He was shouting at the officers." He hesitated. Marshall took a step closer, her tones soft, guiding, like she was helping him find the truth rather than feeding him a script. "Take your time, Mr. Tate." Brian exhaled sharply. He was getting in their faces. I remember thinking, man, this guy is going to get himself arrested. And then, another pause. His eyes flickered toward Malcolm, just for a second, then away again. Marshall waited. Brian exhaled. Then he pushed one of them, hard. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One of the jurors shifted in their seat. Another scribbled something in their notepad. The weight in the room shifted. Because now it wasn't just a video. Now it was a witness. A man, an everyday citizen, claiming he had seen it happen. And for some people, that was all it took. Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink, but he could feel it. The air in the room, the way the doubt had started to creep into the faces of the jury, the way the trap was closing in. This wasn't just an attack. This was an execution. And if he didn't fight back, they were going to bury him alive. For a long moment after Brian Tate's testimony, the courtroom remained silent. The jury shifted, some looking down at their notes, others stealing glances at Malcolm. Doubt had settled in. And that was exactly what the prosecution wanted. Then slowly, Jonathan Pierce stood. Unlike Colleen Marshall, he didn't adjust his suit, didn't flash a polished smile. He simply rose, unhurried, taking a moment to button his jacket before stepping forward. He was older, his presence calm but commanding. A man who had seen too many lies, had fought against too much corruption, to be rattled by a well-rehearsed show. He turned toward the witness stand, fixing Brian Tate with a steady gaze. "Mr. Tate," he said, voice smooth but firm. "You seem nervous. Are you nervous?" Brian blinked, a hesitation, just for a second. Then he straightened his shoulders. "And no," he muttered, just not used to being in court." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Not used to being in court?" He paused, then turned, walking leisurely toward the jury. "That's interesting. Because according to public records, this isn't your first time on the witness stand, is it, Mr. Tate? The room tensed. Brian stiffened. Colleen Marshall shifted slightly in her seat. Jonathan picked up a file from the defense table, flipping it open as if he had all the time in the world. In fact, he continued, his tone casual but deliberate, you've been here before. More than once. Would you like me to refresh your memory? Brian swallowed hard. Objection. Marshall cut in. Relevance? Jonathan didn't even look at her. Your Honor, I'm establishing credibility. Or rather, the lack of it. Judge Whitfield eyed him carefully, then nodded. Proceed carefully, Mr. Pierce. Jonathan nodded once, then turned back to Brian. Let's talk about 2016, he said smoothly. You were arrested, weren't you? Brian's jaw tightened. For theft. Jonathan continued before Brian could deny it. Petty larceny, to be exact. But that charge disappeared, didn't it? Brian shifted in his seat. Jonathan's voice remained calm, controlled. You know what else is interesting? You didn't just walk away from that charge. You started working with the police. The air in the courtroom changed. A few members of the jury sat up straighter. Even the gallery had gone completely silent. Jonathan let that moment stretch, let it sink in. In fact, he continued, court records show that since 2017, you have provided key testimony in 3 separate cases, all involving Westbridge PD officers. He let out a short breath, flipping the file shut. That's an interesting coincidence, don't you think? Brian's fingers curled slightly against the wooden railing. His gaze darted toward Colleen Marshall, as if searching for guidance. But Marshall didn't meet his eyes, she knew. And now, so did everyone else. Jonathan let Brian sit with his own silence for a moment before stepping back toward the defense table. Now, he said, his voice shifting, turning sharper, let's talk about that video. He turned toward the jury. You saw it, we all saw it. But I have one simple question. Where is the full version? A few jurors frowned. The prosecution conveniently provided us with a carefully selected clip, one that conveniently jumps at just the right moments. He turned toward Colleen Marshall, his expression almost curious. Miss Marshall, where is the unedited footage? Colleen's expression remained unreadable. The footage was provided to us by the Westbridge Police Department, she said smoothly. This is the only version available. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. That's odd. He turned toward the judge, his voice clear, steady. Your Honor, we filed a request for the full surveillance footage from the city's street cameras. But this morning, we were informed that the original footage is, and I quote, unavailable due to technical issues. The room stirred. A juror frowned. Someone in the gallery whispered, Of course it is. Jonathan let that information settle before speaking again. So let's recap, shall we? He spread his hands. We have a highly edited video that makes my client look like a criminal. We have a witness with a history of working with the police, whose testimony just so happens to match the footage perfectly. And now, the only footage that could prove otherwise. He scoffed lightly. Gone. He turned back toward the jury, letting his next words land with precision. Ladies and gentlemen, does that sound like justice to you? Silence. Even Ridley and Thompson, seated at the prosecution's table, had stopped smirking. Because for the first time since this trial began, they had lost control of the narrative. Malcolm had spent his life fighting against injustice. But now he was realizing just how deep this corruption ran. For the first time since this trial began, Malcolm Graves lowered his head. Not in defiance, not in quiet determination, but in something dangerously close to defeat. He sat motionless at the defense table, hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the polished wood in front of him. The sound of the courtroom faded, muffled voices, shuffling papers, the occasional cough. It all blended into the background like the distant echoes of a battle that had already been lost. Because maybe that was exactly what this was. A war he had never been meant to win. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for truth, for accountability. He had stood against corruption, exposed abuse, and refused to be silent. And yet, here he was, sitting in the very machine he had spent years trying to dismantle, caught in its gears, crushed beneath its weight. He felt it happening. The shift. The jury was no longer looking at him the same way. Before, there had been uncertainty, maybe even skepticism toward the prosecution's case. But now there was doubt. Not about the system, not about the officers, about him. The prosecution had done its job well. The doctored video, the fake witness, the missing evidence. They had turned this trial into a performance, and like any well-scripted show, the audience was starting to believe the illusion. And Malcolm? He was the villain they had written him to be. Across the room, Jack Ridley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk slow and self-satisfied. He didn't need to say anything. His expression said it all. This is how it ends. Beside him, Daniel Thompson exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You actually thought you had a chance. Malcolm clenched his hands beneath the table, his fingers curling into tight fists. They wanted him to break. Not just in front of the jury, in front of the cameras, in front of the world. They wanted him to feel what every man like him had felt before. Powerless, helpless, defeated. And for the first time since this nightmare began, it was working. The fire inside him flickered. Not out, not yet. But it was dimming, struggling against the suffocating weight pressing down on him. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every man who had ever sat in this chair, in a courtroom like this, watching a system built to protect the guilty erase them with a stroke of a pen. This was about every name that had become a headline. Every mother who had buried a son and been told justice had been served. Every voice that had been silenced before it could be heard. Maybe truth didn't matter. Maybe justice was just a word. Maybe they had already won. And then, a breath. Deep, slow, controlled. His fingers uncurled, his jaw unclenched, his shoulders squared. And just for a moment he lifted his eyes. Not all the way. Not enough to give Ridley and Thompson the satisfaction of seeing his expression. But enough. Enough for the jury. Enough for Jonathan Pierce, who had been watching him carefully from across the table. And in that moment, Malcolm realized something. They wanted him to believe he was already buried. But they had made one mistake. He was still breathing. And as long as he was breathing, this wasn't over. A hush fell over the courtroom. The doors at the back creaked open, the sound cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoed against the polished floor. Then a voice, steady, unshaken. Your Honor, I have something to say. Every head turned. Standing at the entrance was Carmen Ellis. She was small, her frame slightly bent with age, but her presence carried weight. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, her Sunday best coat buttoned all the way up. And in her hands, she clutched a small leather purse, the kind that held decades of folded bills, worn-out photographs, and the weight of untold truths. Judge Whitfield peered over her glasses. Mrs. Ellis, do you have information relevant to this case? Carmen took a slow step forward. Yes, ma'am, I do. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Even the jury exchanged quiet glances. At the prosecution's table, Colleen Marshall's posture stiffened. This wasn't part of the plan. Carmen was sworn in, her hands trembling slightly, but not with fear, with something else. Jonathan Pierce approached the stand, his voice low, steady. Mrs. Ellis, can you tell us what you saw the night Malcolm Graves was arrested? Carmen lifted her chin. I saw everything. The weight of her words settled over the room. I was sitting on my porch that night. It was warm. I had my tea, my book. I remember it clear as day. She turned to the jury, her sharp eyes scanning their faces. I saw Malcolm come home from his event. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just walking. Her breath hitched slightly, but she kept going. Then I saw the police. The air shifted. Ridley and Thompson sat up just a little straighter. They weren't there for an investigation, Carmen continued. They were there for him. They didn't ask no questions. They didn't read him no rights. They just, her voice cracked, a tremor of anger of something long buried. They just grabbed him. Another leaned forward slightly. Jonathan's voice was calm but firm. Did Malcolm resist? Carmen let out a dry, humorless laugh. Resist? Honey, he never even got the chance. The courtroom stilled. Colleen Marshall rose slowly, smoothing her blazer, her expression carefully controlled. Mrs. Ellis, with all due respect, it was late. It was dark. Are you absolutely certain of what you saw? Carmen's lips pressed together. Miss Marshall, I may be old, but my eyes still work just fine. A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the gallery. Marshall's jaw tightened. Mrs. Ellis, did you hear what Mr. Graves and the officers were saying? Could it be possible that he was being aggressive? Silence. And then, Carmen laughed softly, not in amusement, in something else. She turned her gaze toward Marshall, her voice quieter now, but carrying decades of truth. Young lady, I lived through Jim Crow. A beat. I know what happens when the wrong people decide a man like Malcolm Graves needs to disappear. The courtroom froze. Even Judge Whitfield shifted in her seat. Colleen Marshall swallowed. Mrs. Ellis, you never mentioned this before. Why come forward now? Carmen turned her gaze to the jury. Because I have spent my whole life biting my tongue. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of years spent staying silent. Looking the other way, convincing myself that speaking up wouldn't change a damn thing. A deep breath, her fingers curled around the edge of the witness stand. But I won't do it this time. Her voice cracked, but her conviction didn't. I won't be able to live with myself if I keep quiet. A single tear slid down her cheek. This man is innocent. Silence. Heavy. Weighted. Alive. A few jurors looked away. Others really watched her. Even Judge Whitfield let out a slow exhale as if trying to process the moment. And across the room, for the first time since the trial began, Ridley and Thompson weren't smirking. They weren't whispering. They were watching. Watching as the first crack formed in the wall they had built. Watching as the story they had carefully crafted began to fall apart. And Malcolm? For the first time in this entire trial, he saw a way out. But then, Malcolm does something no one expects. He stands and reveals exactly who he is. The courtroom was still reverberating from Carmen Ellis's words. Her testimony had shaken something loose, a crack in the carefully crafted narrative of the prosecution. But Malcolm Graves, he had remained silent. Until now. Jonathan Pierce adjusted his tie, stepping forward. His voice was measured, deliberate. Mr. Graves, he began, his gaze steady, could you tell the jury about your experience in the field of security? The question seemed simple, almost routine, but something shifted. Malcolm straightened in his seat, slowly, deliberately. Then he lifted his chin, his deep brown eyes locking onto the jurors, and when he spoke his voice was calm, clear, unshaken. I am a senior official with the Department of Homeland Security. Silence. Not the kind that came with simple surprise, but the kind that weighed on the air, pressing down on every person in the room. A beat passed, then another. It took a moment before the meaning of his words fully registered. The court stenographer's hands froze over the keys. A juror's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. Someone in the gallery sucked in a sharp breath. At the prosecution's table, Colleen Marshall's fingers clenched slightly over her papers, her polished confidence faltering. And across the room, Ridley and Thompson? They went completely still. Thompson's Adam's apple bobbed in a hard swallow, his once cocky expression drained of color. Ridley's jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffening. For the first time there was something raw in his eyes. Not arrogance, fear. They had mocked him, arrested him, framed him. And now, they had just realized who they had put in handcuffs. Judge Whitfield was the first to break the silence. She adjusted her glasses, her voice slower than usual. Mr. Graves, could you clarify that for the court? Malcolm nodded once. For the past 15 years, I have worked in national security. I've spent the majority of my career investigating domestic threats, organized crime, and corruption. My current position places me as one of the senior officials overseeing law enforcement accountability and counterterrorism efforts nationwide. He paused. Then, he let his next words hang in the air like a loaded weapon. And that includes internal misconduct within police departments. The temperature in the room shifted. Jonathan Pierce stepped back slightly, allowing the weight of Malcolm's revelation to settle. Because now, this wasn't just a case about a civilian wrongfully arrested. This was a federal officer, one with the power, the resources, and the authority to expose exactly what Ridley and Thompson had been doing for years. This wasn't a trial. This was a reckoning. And Ridley and Thompson had just realized they weren't the ones in control anymore. The weight of Malcolm's revelation still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The courtroom had just learned they hadn't been prosecuting an ordinary man. But what came next? That was going to be far worse. Jonathan Pierce adjusted his tie, stepping forward, his expression unreadable. Mr. Graves, he said, his voice calm but sharp, do you have any evidence to support your claims regarding misconduct within the Westbridge Police Department? Malcolm exhaled slowly. Then he reached into his jacket. A flicker of movement, a rustle of paper. And then he pulled out a manila folder. Not thick, not dramatic, but deadly. The courtroom stilled. It wasn't just curiosity that held the air captive. It was fear. Because in that folder, contained within just a few sheets of paper, was something more dangerous than any testimony or eyewitness account. It was proof. Malcolm placed the folder on the defense table. Then, slowly, deliberately, he tapped it once. His eyes locked onto the jury. "What I hold in my hands," he began, his voice steady, lethal, "is a classified intelligence report compiled by the Department of Homeland Security over the past 18 months. A report detailing widespread corruption within the Westbridge Police Department, corruption that extends all the way to the top." A ripple of unease passed through the room. This wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. This was about all of them. He lifted the first page and began to read. Documented evidence of falsified police reports, missing body camera footage, unlawful arrests targeting Black and Latino residents at disproportionately high rates, patterns of excessive force linked specifically to officers Jack Ridley and Daniel Thompson. He turned the next page. Financial records, wire transfers, confidential statements from whistleblowers within the department. The room grew tighter. Malcolm's voice dropped lower, colder. Officers Ridley and Thompson received multiple unreported payments from an unnamed source within city government. In exchange, they covered up police misconduct, including violent altercations that resulted in civilian deaths. The murmurs became a roar. In the gallery, someone gasped. A juror's pen slipped from their fingers, rolling across the desk. Even Judge Whitfield shifted in her seat, her usual mask of neutrality faltering. But the next words Malcolm spoke hit like a gunshot. And at the top of it all, a pause, a deep, suffocating silence. Then, he turned the page one last time. Chief of Police Henry Mercer, the man who has spent the last decade silencing complaints, suppressing evidence, and ensuring that officers like Ridley and Thompson never see consequences for their actions. The reaction was instant. Half the gallery shot to their feet, voices colliding in a mess of outrage and disbelief. Jurors exchanged stunned looks, their carefully composed faces cracking under the weight of what they had just heard. Judge Whitfield slammed her gavel down. Order. The noise barely subsided. At the prosecution's table, Colleen Marshall sat frozen. Her fingers gripped the edges of her paperwork, knuckles white. Her lips parted, as if searching for a response, but nothing came. Because what could she say? This wasn't just reasonable doubt. This wasn't just one man's word against another's. This was a scandal that could bring the entire department crumbling down. And she had been the one defending it. Across the room, Ridley and Thompson sat like men awaiting execution. The arrogance was gone. The smirks had vanished. What was left? A hollow, quiet terror. Ridley's jaw flexed, his fingers twitching where they rested on the table. Thompson? His breath came too fast, his panic barely concealed beneath the thin mask of control. Because now they knew. There was no spinning this, no lying their way out. They had mocked him, arrested him, framed him, and now they understood exactly who they had put in handcuffs. And worse, they knew that no badge, no brotherhood, no corrupt chain of command was going to save them. This time, they hadn't just gone after the wrong man. They had buried themselves. And Malcolm? He had just handed them the shovel. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. 12 men and women sat in the jury box, their faces unreadable, their decisions sealed inside a single, folded piece of paper. A bailiff stepped forward, taking the slip from the foreman's trembling fingers. The entire room held its breath. Ridley sat rigid, his fists clenched on the table, his once smug expression now a mask of cold dread. Thompson beside him looked as if he had just swallowed glass. They weren't so sure anymore. They weren't in control anymore. Judge Whitfield accepted the paper, unfolding it with careful precision. Her gaze swept over the words, then lifted to the jury. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged woman with wary eyes, stood. We have, Your Honor. A pause. A beat of silence so loud it could shatter glass. On the charge of falsifying police reports, guilty. The first blow landed. A murmur spread through the crowd, a mix of shock, vindication, disbelief. Ridley flinched, just barely. Thompson squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing sharp and unsteady. On the charge of excessive force, guilty. Another impact. In the gallery, a woman pressed a hand to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. Somewhere a quiet yes escaped someone's lips on the charge of unlawful arrest, guilty. By now the murmurs had become a storm. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, people shifted in their seats, stunned. This wasn't just a verdict. This was history. Judge Whitfield let the noise settle before turning her sharp gaze to Ridley and Thompson. This court finds you guilty on all counts. A formal sentencing hearing will be scheduled, at which time appropriate measures, including potential federal charges, will be discussed. She looked at the bailiff. Take them into custody. The moment the handcuffs clicked shut around their own wrists, Ridley's head snapped toward Malcolm. That look. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hatred. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was never invincible to begin with. But the fallout didn't stop there, because Malcolm hadn't just exposed two dirty cops. He had exposed an entire system. Within hours of the verdict, the Westbridge Police Department was in full crisis mode. News crews swarmed outside, reporters shouting questions at city officials. The mayor's office scrambled to distance itself from the department. Internal Affairs launched an emergency review of police conduct spanning over a decade, and at the center of it all, Chief of Police Henry Mercer, the man Malcolm had named, the man who had protected officers like Ridley and Thompson for years. Now he was under federal investigation. It wasn't just about one trial anymore. It was about every case these men had ever touched, every family that had been silenced, every complaint that had been buried, and for the first time, they were all coming back to light. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with people, protesters, activists, families who had lost loved ones to police violence. Some held signs, some raised fists, some simply stood in silence, watching. Jonathan Pierce walked beside Malcolm, the weight of victory settling between them. "You did it," Pierce murmured. "It's over." Malcolm didn't answer right away. He looked past the cameras, the flashing lights, the faces filled with relief, anger, hope, because the truth was, it wasn't over. Not even close. Yes, Ridley and Thompson were gone. Yes, the department was crumbling. But the system? The system was still standing. And Malcolm knew better than anyone it wouldn't fall that easily. Because even as Malcolm walked away, he knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sun was beginning to dip below the city skyline, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. The chaos of the trial still echoed behind them. Reporters shouting, cameras flashing, murmurs of victory and disbelief. But Malcolm Graves had already turned away from it all. He descended the courthouse steps, each step steady, unhurried. The weight of what had happened inside those walls clung to him. But so did something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. And then, a voice. Small, unsure. "Sir?" Malcolm turned. Standing a few feet away was a boy, maybe 12, maybe 13. His skin was dark like Malcolm's, his hoodie slightly too big for his thin frame, but it was his eyes that caught Malcolm's attention, wide, searching, filled with something Malcolm recognized all too well. "Do you think things will change?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The world seemed to slow. Malcolm studied the boy, seeing not just a child, but a younger version of himself. A boy who had probably grown up hearing stories about men like him. Men who had spoken out, men who had fought back, men who had disappeared, men who had lost. He could have told the boy the truth. That one verdict wouldn't fix a system built to protect men like Ridley and Thompson. That corruption wasn't just in Westbridge, but everywhere. That real change? It was slow. Painful, brutal. Instead, Malcolm knelt down slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. He placed a firm, steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. His voice wasn't just firm. It was a promise. "But if we don't give up, it will come." For a moment, the boy just stared at him. Then, he nodded. A small movement. But enough. Malcolm straightened, stepping back into the golden light of the setting sun. His silhouette stretched long across the pavement as he walked forward, the courthouse looming behind him like a ghost of battles past. He didn't look back. Because this wasn't the end. It was just another chapter. And as he disappeared into the city streets, one question lingered in the air, resting heavy in the hearts of those who had witnessed his fight. Had justice truly changed? Bookmark. Or was this just one small victory in a war still far from over? If this story moved you, Don't let it stop here. Hit the like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that shine a light on truth and justice. Your support means everything. It fuels our mission to create meaningful content that sparks conversation, challenges perspectives, and inspires change. Together, we can make sure stories like Malcolm's are heard, remembered, and never ignored. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.